We have two flagship funds and a bunch of, we've done a bunch of side pocket investments as well. We're going to be launching our third fund in the beginning of next year. And we've invested in about 20 different companies so far. We look at growth equity companies that have been around for a while that we're agnostic as far as if it's plant touching or non-plant touching. We also have a SPAC in the market that we launched about 6 months ago. And, so we're a full service firm looking at the private markets in cannabis.
And I'm Mina Mishrikey, filling in for Mitch, who's our managing partner, Merida Capital. We have just launched our fourth fund in 5 years. We have about 600 million of assets under management. We also have a SPAC similar to Mark's fund, Tuatara. And we invest in all parts of the cannabis ecosystem. Our first fund was not plant touching. Every fund since is touching the plant, as well as investing in ancillary companies.
Live via satellite, Mitch Barukowitz. Hello, Mitch. Do you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Do you want to talk about what Merida's up to, what your strategy is? Or do you want to?
Yeah, Mitch, I just gave an introduction, so I think we'll leave it at that and delve into questions.
Okay. Well, did he hear me? Yeah. Oh, okay. Are you gonna? Is he? I think he's frozen though. Anyway, I guess we'll just keep going.
Yeah, video call is let's just. I hope we sort that out in the video call.
Okay. Well, anyway, so Mitch, could you talk about the recent SPAC that you announced with Leafly, and what led you to the altar with Leafly? Or do you want to take that?
Sure, I'll chime in. I think we have our SPAC listed on the NASDAQ and Canadian NEO Stock Exchange in November of 2019. We dual listed to give us some optionality in terms of investing in a company that touches the plant versus doesn't, and just to provide some color for everyone here. If you invest in a federally illegal business, a plant touching business in the United States, then the U.S. exchanges will not let you list on those exchanges. And so if we were to invest in a plant touching company in the U.S., we would have had to have delisted it from the NASDAQ. We think a lot about the connection between the evolvement, I guess, of brands in the space. There really aren't any brands in cannabis, maybe cookies. I think some people announced or spoke about cookies earlier. But the industry is certainly going to a place where brands have a lot more power than they currently do. You think about when you walk into a liquor store. If you walk into a liquor store and they don't have your Johnny Walker Black or whatever, you're never going to go to that liquor store again. And so at some point, that evolvement is going to happen. We're not there yet. We think about the connection to the consumer and how brands really do not have a direct connection to consumers. Everything works through the retailer right now. And we just think about Leafly as a perfect portal for creating that greater connection over time. They have 10 million monthly active users on the website. It's the #1 website in the industry. And they have as customers half of the industry in terms of retailers and brands. And they have an e-commerce business that they're developing as well. So it seems like a great springboard for the thesis that brands will gain power over time as the industry evolves.
And Mark, where's Tuatara in the process with your SPAC?
So, as mentioned, we launched a SPAC about 6 months ago. We were able to negotiate a 2-year timeline, so about 1.5 years left on our SPAC. We're NASDAQ SPAC. We're the first SPAC that JP Morgan had done in the cannabis space. We had JP Morgan as the lead, and we had BMO as the co-lead. And so we're actively looking at different transactions. We have a pretty robust pipeline that we're going through. And so because, as you mentioned, because we're a NASDAQ listed SPAC in the United States, we can only look at ancillary companies, non-plant touching companies in the United States, but we can also look at other jurisdictions where it's legal outside the United States. So as long as it's federally legal in whatever jurisdiction. So we have an active pipeline and currently looking at a couple companies right now.
Great.
Yeah.
And John, you are focused on the public companies. Why do you think it's important for investors to invest and get exposure into the cannabis via a public company?
Sure. Yeah, I think the investing in the public equities in cannabis is extremely important. Just looking at the return profile of companies right now when it comes to private cannabis companies versus companies that are in the public markets. Generally, VCs are looking to exit on an IPO or go public transaction, and just public equity returns just have a totally different return profile than that. Currently, we're in a market environment where things can overshoot in terms of valuations in a rather rapid fashion. The ratification and retail traders that have come into the market this year have driven valuations to generally pretty absurd levels in certain markets. That's certainly a possibility in cannabis. It depends if it's where the stocks are listed, obviously. But also just in terms of the strategics that are investing in cannabis today, most of those strategics, being the large CPG companies, have only been able to invest in large public companies in Canada. We think that they're just waiting to invest even larger tickets into the U.S. operators once it goes fairly legal. And then the last, I think, extremely important reason right now is just that the valuations on the U.S. Plant touching side of things have come down to levels that they're actually trading at discounts to a lot of plant touching assets in the private markets. So the capital markets are for the most part shut for plant touching assets to go public. And about a year ago, MSOs in the public markets were extremely excited about bolting on assets and single state operator assets at 6 times forward EBITDA. And currently, some of the largest multi-state operators today are trading at 6 times forward EBITDA. So it creates an extremely attractive valuation perspective when it comes to investing for the future in cannabis.
You know what I find really compelling is in the world of SPACs. So you have Merida, you have Tuatara. You guys have been looking at the space for many years now. You've seen a lot. To me, it would seem there's a lot of strategic value. So you invest in Leafly, but are there any portfolio companies within the within the Merida portfolio that you think you could fit into what you're working on now? And if you can't answer that, it's specific.
Yeah, I think with Leafly, just given their breadth of coverage of the space, they already actually work with a lot of our portfolio companies. We have about 60 investments in the space right now. So a lot of those synergies already exist. We think we can really springboard some of their businesses, especially on the e-commerce side, by plugging them into some companies that they're not currently working with. So we'll see about that. But I'm sure Mark will tell you, that this finding the right partner has been a challenge because there's really not that many businesses that are private that are of the scale that, if you're a $100 million or $150 million SPAC, if you're looking to take a minority stake or maybe a majority stake, you're talking about a valuation of a private valuation of a business that is worth about $250 million and higher. And there's just not a lot of private companies that are of that critical mass and size that are ready for the big show in the public markets. And so, we feel good about what we found, and in particular, because of the synergies and your question, I don't want to get into specifics of, portfolio companies, but that's maybe the first thing we think about when we invest in companies. We've invested in 60 companies. We think about how do they fit. So.
And Mark, where we are today, 7 years later, 8 years later since I first met you in Vegas at one of the first MJ Biz shows. Obviously there's been some progress on the federal front. We're not there yet. But what's your take on where we are and what we need to do?
I think we've seen a couple cycles in the cannabis market, you know, going back to when we met, and I think the first big catalyst that we saw was the CSE allowing cannabis companies to be listed in Canada, and so I think that was the first big bull run we saw in 2017, and bunch of companies ran up to Canada and got listed. Many of them shouldn't have been public companies, and we've seen the fallout. Some of them were able to access capital and were able to be successful. And we've seen some of the ones, you know, the Pure Leafs and others of the world that have been very successful, you know, being able to access capital. I think the next big regulatory hurdle that we saw was the passage of the Farm Bill in 2018, and that was, you know, a big run on CBD and hemp and that side of the equation over the last couple of years, and that's kind of been the last run. We've stalled out a bit, and as John's mentioned, it's been hard to get to raise capital for some of these companies in the private markets lately, and especially plant-touching companies specifically. And I think the next big impetus and what everybody's been waiting for is some form of regulatory change. And so I think, you know, the hope was that having the Democrats having, you know, control of all the aspects of Congress would be able to make that finally happen. We're not seeing it yet, but I'm still very optimistic that I think, you know, in the next 12 months, we'll see some bill that will get passed. And I think that's really the next genesis that we're looking for. I think you'll still see the markets here in emerging markets. So I think you're still going to see these markets be very choppy. You're going to see a lot of, you know, a lot up and downs over the next couple of years. But, you know, I think that's really what the market's waiting for. And I think we all are very optimistic that we're going to see that happen in the next year to 2 years and some form of it. And, you know, you're also seeing that take place in the state markets, you know, with raw material prices that have kind of oscillated a lot. And so until you get some form of firming in the federal regulatory side, and we have some, you know, and you have some time for that to work through the system, I think that's going to be really the catalyst that everybody in this industry is really hoping for, you know, to see the success of this industry take place.
And that's just such a compelling opportunity to invest, because as we see quarter after quarter, all these companies, you know, crushing it, hitting on all cylinders. Nobody's, you know, gunning for the iceberg anymore. You know, we've already seen that. So with the federal legalization where it is status quo, I mean, that's, I think, causing the disconnect between the Canadian LPs and, you know, what we're seeing in the U.S. Now, John, in the U.S., you know, there's a lot of volatility, obviously, in these stocks. You know, it's very frustrating. I used to work at a hedge fund, and I know, you know, I had Pepto-Bismol, you know, by our desk, because sometimes it's, you know, some days are more difficult to bear than others. But how are you able to capture alpha when all these stocks are, you know, whipsawed?
Yeah, it's definitely an extremely choppy environment out there. It's a market that's, you know, it's an emerging market. It's a very inefficient market. There's a ton of volatility. I think I can count more 40% off the high moves since I've been investing in the space than I can count on one hand. And at Measure 8, on the hedge fund side, you know, we take what we like to call a full spectrum approach to investing and trading the sector. And so what that means is that we have a fundamental approach to our long-short strategy where we think that we can drive alpha by picking the winners and losers. Right now, we're in an environment that, yes, fundamentals are on the up, and every single quarter you're starting to get a real stamp of approval on these businesses. But I think over time, as the market evolves and, you know, regulatory changes start to happen, there's a lot of business models right now in the public markets that won't withstand the test of time. And so that presents a pretty good opportunity in terms of the short side of things. You know, picking companies that we think that, you know, might not survive when the market finally does go full federal legalized, and you know, margins will compress in a lot of these business models. When it comes to Canada, you know, those are companies that right now that, you know, you can kind of get a glimpse into an environment where you see a supply glut, and really that's what Canada's had to deal with since they legalized. You know, whether we're heading for that in the U.S., I typically think that the demand side in the U.S. is looking a lot better once we go full federally legal. That you're not going to get. There's just such a bigger market in the U.S. Just for reference, the size, the adult use market in Colorado is about the same size as the entire Canadian market. Yet, if you just look at the market caps in Canada versus you know, private companies or public companies in Colorado alone, you know, it more than dwarfs the Colorado public markets.
It seems to me it'd be really difficult to short in this space, just because like every company has a bullseye on it. Yeah. So you might be at the bottom of the barrel, but if you're somewhat marginally okay, he's going to take you out. So how do you short in an environment like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it's a riskier sector to put on shorts in, but there's also a sector where there's a lot of frothiness. We favor putting on shorts that are companies that are more liquid, so listed on major exchanges. A lot of them have options listed, so we can kind of manage our downside via options. And we've been able to, trade around events and catalysts in the sector, and also, put on thoughtful shorts, which were timed in conjunction with catalysts that we felt like the stock was going to go down in the short term, to really, manage that volatility in the sector. We've been able to kind of outperform the ETFs with about half of the volatility, just by being able to use that kind of full spectrum approach.
Excellent. So one question I'd like to ask all you guys, what's your view of how the industry will look once, 10, 15 years, when federal legalization has kicked in? Will we see dispensaries the way they exist today? Is it going to be Amazon just dropping a drone in front of your house? I mean, how do you think about how the industry will look and how that would impact your investment appetite?
I guess I'll take that first. I think there's definitely, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a trend towards brands having a closer connection with consumers. A lot of brands can't advertise on traditional media right now, the Facebooks and Googles of the world. That's going to change eventually. SEO will play a bigger part in the industry. The disaggregation of the brand and the consumer with the retailers stuck in between will change as e-commerce comes into the space. I think you have a lot of quote-unquote OGs that are consumers now in the market, and that are continuing to come from the illicit market and migrate from the illicit market. I think that will continue. But I think when you think about new consumers, you're going to see an older demographic that is going to start entering the space. You're going to see probably the highest growth area in the space is going to be the female consumer, and that's an area that we're very focused on investing in, is brands that are focused on the female consumer. And then I think there's all these other areas that, we don't have to go into detail here, but I think, synthetic cannabinoids, I know Mark's fund has invested heavily in that space. We have as well. I think that's going to be a trend when big pharma and big box CPG, the Coca-Colas of the world, that want to make a CBD drink, when they come into this space, they're going to want chemical ingredients. They're not going to want botanical sourced ingredients. And then one area that I'm very passionate about is industrial hemp. We're investing heavily in that space as well, and we see that as a huge opportunity set with a supply chain that doesn't exist right now. It feels very much like cannabis half a decade ago.
How about you, Mark?
Yeah, no, I would kind of agree with everything that was said. I think the things I would also emphasize, I personally think you're going to see for the next several years that the continued model that we're seeing, state level dispensaries, the education process, the brand recognition that's going to go on, the building of brands. I think that's going to take place over the next 3 to 7, 10 years. But ultimately, what you're going to see is you will see more of a delivery Amazon-based model. I think there will always be dispensaries like their specialty stores and other products. But over time, as the consumers get educated and understand which products they like, which brands start to flourish, I think you'll start seeing delivery service, Amazon, drones, whatever it might be, that to get your cannabis, like other people are purchasing other things over time. I think there will definitely be and then there'll also be consumption clubs that I would think will pop up over time, as cannabis becomes more socially accepted. So I think there'll be other outlets for people to purchase cannabis through things like that, and clubs and consumption clubs. But I think ultimately you'll see 5, 10 years forward, you'll see more of a delivery-based, Amazon-based, way to purchase your cannabis.
How about you?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that, this industry looking out forward, I think everyone would agree that, this industry is going to look very similar to traditional CPG industries. I think the billion-dollar question is really how we get there and who the winners are. And so, there's a ton of risks overlaid on terms of how it shapes out in terms of the regulations. Interstate commerce is going to be, a really big deal when it comes to the current business models right now. And in terms of the margins that you're seeing in states like Florida, where you have a certain amount of licenses servicing the whole state, and they have to be vertically integrated under interstate commerce kind of model. There's a lot of operators there that are going to see a lot of margin compression. But in my opinion, you're going to need that to really have to be able to build national brands at scale. And ultimately, building a national brand is what companies are going to be able to sustain margins in the long run. And there's going to be a lot of verticals in the industry that might be valuable now that eventually will just be commoditized. I think that just cultivation in general is a thing that I think consensus is thinking that over time will be commoditized. There's a lot of disruptions that could happen in terms of that. Biosynthesis, I know everyone on the stage has looked at the biosynthesis and the production of cannabinoids at scale in the lab. That's one area of disruption. So there's a lot of different avenues it can go to, but I think that ultimately a large-scale CPG industry is what we're headed for.
So I always thought about the industry as, 3 lanes, right? You have the rec market, which is what really everybody's interested in. And then you have, well, not everybody, but, and then you have medical, which will take a different turn. It'll be recalibrated, redefined, when big pharma steps in, and then health and wellness. So how do you think about, well, in terms of like when we're going to get there, where we're going to have true pharma, in pharma invested in medical, and where it's really medical bound? Thoughts around that?
Well, I should have added this to the last question, but we think that the medical opportunity is much bigger than other. I think that the market conception of the medical market, I think a lot of people migrate towards the adult use market, but I think there will be a time in 10 years where you can walk into a CVS and get a sleeping pill that includes a cannabinoid. And I think we're getting pharma development pitches all the time. To answer your question specifically, I think you'll have a lot of maybe non-big pharma companies taking them hopefully through maybe a phase 2 process, and you often see big pharma come in later on in sort of that phase 3 area. We also think about insurance reimbursement as a reality for certain form factors, and preparing for that and thinking about how do we monetize that is something that's always on our mind.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. And I think the only thing I'd add is I do think that you're going to see that some of the production, a lot of research is going on right now, and I think that's been one of the biggest things that's been lacking in this industry is you couldn't do research at any type of level in the United States. So early on you had research being done in other countries outside the United States, Israel, and other places around the world. Then I think as Canada became legalized, you could start doing research in Canada. So the research is really starting just to come out, and I think and also on some of these minor cannabinoids that are finally getting enough production that you can do testing on it. So I really feel in the next year to 2 years, you're really going to see some great research come out, and that's going to be the catalyst to get some of these pharmaceutical companies behind it. And then whether it's production through regular growing of cannabis or it's some sort of biosynthetic production of these chemicals and these molecules, I think is going to be the real genesis to seeing this market take off, because then you can really drill down on these minor cannabinoids and be able to look at different formulations. And so I personally think that's coming within the next couple of years. It's going to take some time to get through the FDA pathways on a lot of these drugs, but again, 10 years from now, I think you're going to walk into a Duane Reade or a CVS and you're going to be able to purchase your epilepsy drug or your, something for sleep or whatever it might be. And I think that's coming. I think research is really going to be the impetus to kind of make that next step.
Yeah, sure. And do you guys, you're mostly just on the MSO side, right? So
no, actually, we focus on all the different verticals, and we focused on companies like GW Pharma, and definitely believe in the pharmaceutical aspects of cannabis. There's a lot of heavy lifting there. I think it's much easier said than done, and it's going to take some time. Just looking at the amount of money and time that GW Pharma spent to getting a clinically approved, FDA approved CBD drug. Now looking at what it's going to take to get other cannabinoids through, it's going to be very difficult. But GW Pharma was a multi-billion-dollar acquisition, and so there's a huge market out there. And one last thing I'll say on this subject is if you just look at who is lobbying against cannabis, you can kind of get a sense of what industries are scared of what cannabis can disrupt. So when it comes to big pharma and different cannabinoids and what they have the potential to disrupt, I think that's that there's a lot of blue sky there when it comes to the big pharma.
Sure.
I would also agree with the comment that we think the medical market, the true pharmaceutical medical market, 10 years forward will be larger than the recreational market.
Great. I think that's about where we are right now. And thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Thanks to this panel. And no, you're free to go now. It's no longer a hostage situation. You can leave. Hey, look, I just want to say one thing to this audience before you leave. First of all, thank you for staying. We know that you're here because this was an extraordinary exposition of talent and people who are involved in this business. 10 years from now, we'll look back at this and go, we can't believe it all started out here on the east end of Long Island. Obviously, there are other people doing this. Colorado's been in the business before they have, but the point is, this expo, this night, this happened. These people were here. You learned a lot about it. There is more happening outside, and then at 9 o'clock, this room becomes an after party. You're welcome to stay. The night is just getting started. All the exhibitors are still here. Most of the panelists are still here. Ask them all the questions you want. Thank you very much for joining us. A big round of applause from the last 5 people here for Gary Beerfriend and all of the technical people that made this happen. I'm going to talk now for 30 or 40 more minutes. I'm just kidding. Thank you. Good night. We've enjoyed having you. And for all of us at the Clubhouse and the Cannabis Expo, good night. And man, am I blasted. Thank you.